Welcome to Utah's Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. I'm Elizabeth Hora. I'm public archaeologist at the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Every year, the Utah SHPO hosts a weekly brown bag lecture series, and we feature researchers who are working on Utah archaeology, Utah historic preservation, and national archaeology and historic preservation topics. We ask those folks to present their work to you in a way that people can understand, that isn't so ivory tower, right? You can find our full back catalog of brown bag lectures, and you can sign up for our next live webinars at ushpo.utah.gov/AHP month. Our 2023 lineup will feature 5 guest speakers, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our first one today. So we're kicking off 2023 with a very cool twist on historic preservation: how best to manage deconstruction. So our program today is titled Cultivating a Culture of Reuse, San Antonio's Deconstruction and Circular Economy Program, with our guest, Stephanie Phillips. Stephanie has a master's degree in historic preservation, but for a while now, she has been working on how to deconstruct historic properties in and around San Antonio, Texas. It's kind of an off-the-wall idea from my standpoint. I love it though, because the fact is not everything is able to be preserved. So what is the highest use that these things can have in their second life? So we are so excited to have Stephanie on. And with that, I will pass it over to her. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am so excited to be here with you all today. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Stephanie, and I am the Deconstruction and Circular Economy Program Manager for the City of San Antonio Office of Historic Preservation. That is a lot of words, but I promise they are all very important. And I would love for you all to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're located, the organization you're affiliated with, if any, and maybe even what brought you here today, just to see who's all here and get us kind of connected virtually. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm here to discuss my absolutely favorite topic in the universe, which is cultivating a culture of reuse. And the collection of digital badges, if you will, on the screen includes some of the mantras of this culture that we're creating in San Antonio, including preservation is climate action, repair it all, choose to reuse, and even deconstruct, don't destroy. So some of these may be mantras in your own work, but what I love about seeing them together is that it starts showing how preservation is so clearly connected to a bunch of other fields, especially the growing climate action and adaptation movement. And to best summarize these connections from kind of what we've been doing in San Antonio for the past 5 years or so, I have an animation to show you.
This is the story of 2 homes. They both provide their family shelter and places to make memories. But in time, some may think the lives of these homes are over. The first house gets demolished. Its lumber, windows, doors, bricks, all of it is buried in a landfill and will decay for hundreds of years. This is a waste of more than 41 tons of energy that was used to create the materials that went into the house. That's equivalent to driving your car nearly 93,000 miles, or almost 4 times around the world in greenhouse gas emissions. Construction and demolition waste is the largest source of waste sent to landfills nationally, more than double the household trash we throw out. Wasting building materials by demolition leads to deforestation. It destroys ecosystems and decreases our air quality. In the past decade, the demolition of homes in San Antonio has created over 169,000 tons of waste. That's equivalent to over 100,000 hippos. But it doesn't have to be this way. Remember the other house? It's on the path for deconstruction, meaning its building materials will be taken apart and reused. Like an organ donor, this home's parts will give new life to other buildings. Its bricks and lumber were used as affordable alternatives to repair a home. Its windows were installed in a bakery. Its beautiful old-growth wood is now the flooring in a trendy new restaurant. And with a fresh coat of paint, its front door is now the top of a family's dining room table. It's estimated that reuse, refurbishment, and upcycling generate about 300 jobs for every 10,000 tons of material, meaning that, on average, deconstruction employs 6 times more people than demolition. Deconstruction produces jobs in manufacturing, retail, and building trades, creating a cycle of reuse for building materials. We can protect the future of our older homes and buildings by using materials from their past. This nurtures a healthy environment, continues the legacy of our city's built heritage, and keeps quality materials out of our landfills. San Antonio can lead the way for cities across the world. And it starts with our buildings today. Don't demolish, deconstruct, and reuse. It's the earth-friendly alternative.
Okay, so the squirrel gets me every single time in that video. And that animation was commissioned by our office back in 2021 to really kind of very clearly convey how deconstruction is tied not only to preservation in San Antonio, but to all of these other fields like affordable housing, climate action, waste reduction, in a way that was compelling and clear. And I'm so happy to announce that, the video ends with San Antonio can lead the way. And we're kind of doing that currently with the policy that we adopted in September of 2022. So just last year, our city council voted to adopt a deconstruction ordinance, which means that San Antonio is officially the largest city in the United States to require that older housing stock, if it's approved for removal, has to be deconstructed instead of mechanically demolished. So you see, we have 3 phases that we've adopted as part of that ordinance. And right now, essentially any residential structure that's approved for removal, if it's built in 1920 or earlier, citywide, has to be deconstructed and its materials salvaged for reuse. And then if it's located within a historic district, if it's a landmark, or if it's a neighborhood conservation district, that build date is 1945. And automatically in 2025, those build dates are going to get more recent. So it's going to move to 1945 and earlier across the entire city, and 1960 and earlier in those protected districts. So we are thrilled that we are about 6 months, 7 months into the administration of this ordinance and able to start tracking the impacts of having this kind of policy in place to ensure that buildings, if they're approved for removal, aren't just going to be heading straight to the landfill. But of course, this didn't happen overnight. So I'm going to kind of give you a quick overview of how we got here, and especially how an Office of Historic Preservation, we're the ones administering this ordinance, how a preservation office got here into kind of this space around talking about how buildings are removed and why that's important for our field. And let me tell you, it takes a little bit of vision. So I love showing this image. This is literally a Facebook post from Shannon Miller, who is the director of our office, back in 2016. The date is November 3rd, 2016. And it's referencing this article that talks about the city of Portland, Oregon, adopting a deconstruction ordinance in 2016. They were the first city in North America to adopt an ordinance like this. And Shannon said, "This is on my list for San Antonio. Let's do it in 2017. It makes so much sense for so many reasons." And spoiler alert, as you just heard, we adopted an ordinance last year in 2022. So we did not do it in 2017, but we did start making progress towards that policy development and adoption that very year. And this is really important, right? The reality is that we also started where many of you may be today. And to be honest, this is still kind of our normal, right? It's not something that we're able to stop demolition from happening overnight. With these scenes on the screen, these are all pictures that were taken in San Antonio. The top 2 are, used to be older housing, and the bottom was a commercial structure. And I like to refer to this kind of as business as usual. This is what we're so used to seeing peppering our communities, is demolition, the smashing, the destruction of these images or these houses. And for me, these images are really difficult to look at, but it's our reality, right? We have to confront this. We can't ignore it. And The reason why this kind of was punted into our purview as a city office is that, for years, we had community members coming to us asking and even demanding that something change with demolition, right? They wanted access to the materials if a building couldn't be saved in their own neighborhood, because there was traditional wisdom that, right, older building materials are, tougher, more durable, straight. Like, of course, people are going to want to use them, especially if they want to repair their own homes. So why wouldn't they have access to them, right? And they definitely wanted buildings that they cared about to be treated respectfully at the end of their life instead of violently destroyed. And when I look at these images, I am very much reminded that waste at this scale is such a uniquely human thing. I see craftsmanship, I see old growth lumber, I see trees that grew for hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years, smashed into pieces in a single day. And it just seems so fundamentally human to destroy things like this, right? But that is not the reality of what happens in nature. So I like to kind of make this analogy, destruction at that scale is not the norm in nature. Reuse is. And one of the best examples of a species that is perfectly happy to reuse anything around them are birds. Some of you are like, this lady's talking about birds. What is happening? I promise I'm going to bring it home. But birds will build a nest out of anything. Sticks, amazing. String, sure. Zip ties from an old poster, absolutely fabulous. They will also reuse existing nests that other birds have left behind. They don't see an empty nest and say, you know what, that nest isn't flashy enough. Let's grab a stick of dynamite, blow it up, and start from scratch. They don't import fancy sticks from New Zealand to one up the neighbor bird. No, they use what they have, and they use and reuse what is around them. And as historic preservation professionals, I kind of think that we're like birds. We are constantly thinking of ways to encourage people to reuse buildings that we already have. And as the impacts of climate change continue to deplete our world of its resources, I also believe that it's our responsibility to fiercely advocate for the reuse of building materials if a whole structure cannot be saved. It's our responsibility to help design a system that makes it easier to choose to reuse materials instead of throwing them away. And we have to better learn to emulate our Earth's natural systems instead of continuing to fight them. Unfortunately, attempting to reuse more materials is really challenging because we've made it exceptionally easy to throw things away. We have to undo so many policies, unravel so many systems, and undo a lot of learning to make reuse palatable at scale sometimes. And to redo kind of a legacy of structural policies that make it easy to throw things away, we can't operate within a silo either. And on the screen here is one of the first byproducts of a deconstruction advisory committee that our office formed in 2018 when we formally launched our deconstruction policy initiative. And we brought together stakeholders spanning these industries and many more to help us guide truly localized policy development. And from the beginning, our emphasis was on this interdisciplinary approach. And some of you may be reading the goals on the screen and thinking, this is really similar to my community, right? Like, we're trying to reduce waste, we're trying to improve public health, we're trying to address our affordable housing crisis and combat climate change. And as preservationists, we may not be close to experts in any of these other fields, but our work absolutely intersects with that work as well, of kind of these peer professionals. And when we start opening our sphere of influence, we also are able to more directly engage with those peer industries and reflect on all of the possibilities of preservation and what it can mean to our communities. So from the origins of our field, preservation in practice has often been kind of binary. And what I mean by that is there's a win and there's a loss, right? There's a, X and Y, there's 1 and 0, there's black and white. And preservation of a whole building is often a win. And then anything beyond that is a form of loss, especially demolition. And that loss is to be avoided, right? But by anchoring our work as a fundamental service to our communities, to public health, to climate action, to affordable housing, to equity, all of these things, we're able to kind of open up this space in between that may be kind of uncomfortable, as kind of Elizabeth alluded at the beginning. But it also opens up this amazing opportunity to begin diving into solutions that can help us advance all of these different goals in our communities to build more resilient communities as well. So I've built a deconstruction and material reuse to kind of emphasize in this interstitial space where we've been operating for the past 5 years as a preservation organization. And perhaps one of the clearest connections to that in our work is our reliance on the Secretary of the Interior standards, right? This is kind of a paraphrase from the work that our office or that historic preservation offices typically reference, our national standards from the National Park Service and the Department of Interior. If a historic feature or material is deteriorated beyond repair or missing, it should be reconstructed or replaced in kind, right? This is kind of that guiding goal when we're working with historic properties. So then we have to ask ourselves, the more buildings that we lose like this to demolition, the wrecking ball, machines that crush and destroy in landfill, how much longer will we have access to materials that are truly in kind, right? Original from the construction era. And as time progresses and more of this happens, these materials become increasingly rare, which just prolongs our collective dependency on petroleum-based, short-lived replacement products, which is also a climate issue. And this is one of the alternatives, right? This is, all of the wrecking balls and bulldozers disappear when you're talking about deconstruction. And in their place, humans are taking great care in the removal of a building. And when you see this, the scene looks a little bit more like a construction site. They're dismantling, they're unbuilding slowly and intentionally. They're salvaging the wood siding to repair area homes of the same construction era. They're reclaiming hardwood floors to help build an addition at your neighbor's house. They're collecting the double hung wood windows to build a greenhouse maybe, or to reinstall them in a historic house that has lost one. And in a lot of scenarios, now that this is more commonplace in San Antonio, neighbors are dropping by to gather fixtures that match their homes down the street. And instead of scraping the site clean as well, shrubs and bushes are starting to be relocated to other places, including community gardens and other sites. So even plants are being reused, right? Because we're taking these massive machines off of a site and putting in real people. And while the effects of bulldozing and building loss cannot be fully quelled, right, through deconstruction, this is an alternative to the ubiquity of wrecking balls that pepper our landscape, right? And it helps transition us away from a largely wasteful practice. And something really, really amazing happens when you see a building being deconstructed board by board. And when all of the materials are stacked on site like this, ready to be moved to their new home, it becomes near impossible to accept that we still remove buildings via demolition, right? And you may have heard the phrase, if you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. Well, at a societal scale, when we all start slowly choosing to reuse salvage lumber instead of new lumber or do deconstruction instead of demolition, we begin to collectively say no to things like deforestation, no to destroying our earth to create more redundant things, and no to kind of this take-make waste system that we've designed. And all of those no's help us say yes to a more abundant future. So that's kind of the large message I have for you. Now, as a preservation entity, it was really important for us from the beginning to convey that our deconstruction initiative was not about if a building comes down, but rather how a building comes down, meaning deconstruction is not in any way a preservation alternative. Our efforts are to make deconstruction, slowly but surely, the only building removal method for older structures. Eliminating wholesale demolition is an option. And that's effectively what we've done by adopting a deconstruction ordinance. And by leading with this message, starting back in 2018, we were able to cultivate broad local support from our local preservation community because of this connection. And another key message was this analogy that you see on the screen. Like an organ donor, a structure may have reached the end of its life, but its parts and pieces could help extend the lives of dozens of other local structures. And we still use this analogy daily to really emphasize how reuse at the material level can actually help retain other older and historic structures. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And what's great is that there's so much qualitative information out there that demonstrates that this connection, even historically, was common. We love newspaper archives. We're historic preservationists after all. And this is an example from the 1930s when a structure was deconstructed in downtown San Antonio, and its columns and limestone block were used to rehabilitate a structure on the famous San Antonio River Walk. And you can still see those columns and those materials on that structure today. So we're always using readily available qualitative data, case studies to anchor reuse as a tradition in San Antonio. Because the reality is, demolition isn't something that always occurred historically. It's actually relatively new in the timeline of things. It became a lot more ubiquitous and widespread after World War II, when we invented these giant machines to crush buildings and bulldoze neighborhoods and build our highway network, right? But it's not just a San Antonio story, right? There's likely a lot of examples in your own community historically, pre-World War I, pre-1900s, of reuse happening in your community. That's just what we did. And I'm going to pivot a little bit to the importance of data in how we've been able to adopt a policy like this and start growing our local deconstruction network. So for us, deconstruction or data is essential to effectively communicate the true potential of shifting away from demolition and encouraging widespread reuse. And I think one of the questions that we're always trying to answer, at least I know we are in San Antonio often, is so what? Right? So what if a building is demolished? So what if 100-year-old materials, hardwood flooring, hand-carved corbels, true 12x2 beams from old growth lumber are thrown into a landfill? So what? Right? And it can be really frustrating to have to answer that question over and over and over again. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience can resonate with having to have those conversations with property owners or what have you. But to begin to responding to so what, we definitely had to rely on data to be able to explain, the scale of the problem, but then also to localize the problem and to make it real. So on the screen here are two different visualizations of the same data set. On the right is a line graph that shows the amount of demolitions and the trend of demolitions occurring in San Antonio over the past decade. And for some context, San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the United States, and it's also one of the fastest growing cities in the country. So you can see I kind of made a mark in 2018 that shows even after we started talking about a deconstruction policy initiative and developing something for San Antonio, we've almost seen an exponential increase in the amount of demolitions that we've seen, largely due to more development and higher population. And right now we're trending about over 600 demolitions a year. And that includes all building types, commercial, residential, garages, carriage structures, what have you. But then on the left is a heat map. And this starts telling like a much bigger story. So this is downtown San Antonio, and you can see the higher concentration of demolitions, this is mapped geographically, are occurring on the near west side and the near east sides of San Antonio. And if you were to overlay a redlined map on this map, it would be very, very similar. These are historically redlined communities. These are communities that have seen the brunt of historic disinvestment and intentional exclusion and predatory lending policies over the years. And these are also largely residential structures that have older building stock, right? Like pre-1930, pre-1920. And from studies that we've commissioned in the past, we've also learned that these areas are disproportionately providing affordable housing for our most vulnerable residents. And you may also notice that there are a bunch of these polygons on the screen. So those are representative of our historic districts and our neighborhood conservation districts, which offer more demolition protections. But the reality is, just because these neighborhoods do not have one of those protective overlays doesn't mean that their buildings are any less worthy of preserving or any less worthy of being dismantled instead of destroyed. So this really also helps illustrate that demolition, yes, is something that happens to buildings, but it doesn't happen in a bubble, right? Demolition affects people. And for us, it's been really, really important to kind of illustrate where this is happening and who this is happening to illustrate that reality. And from that, these are kind of our 4 like key issues in San Antonio that we honed in on from all of the work that we have been doing over the years to develop a policy. And again, this data has allowed us to clearly communicate how deconstruction is part of public health and material accessibility and affordability. And I'll run through these quickly. So over the past 10 years, more than $16 million worth of salvageable building materials were sent to local landfills. That's huge. And more than 600 buildings are demolished annually, of course, as I mentioned, but that represents a 70% increase since 2012. And us recognizing the most common building type demolished in San Antonio as older housing also, again, connects us to that housing discussion, right? Demolition also disproportionately affects vulnerable communities. We found it very important to overlay kind of public health data that's available from the CDC and other agencies like the EPA that show that demolition is not something, again, that happens in a bubble or is restricted to a singular site. Demolition can generate dust that travels anywhere from 400 to 600 feet from the source, which can enter open windows and settle into soil and permeate groundwater. And this becomes increasingly important when we factor in kind of how weather might be changing in your community. I know in San Antonio, just last year, we had the most 100-degree days that we've ever had in history. And when it's hotter, the effects of poor air quality are exacerbated. So this entire thing has allowed us as a preservation office to begin talking about these things and talk about it very clearly to our constituents and our elected officials as kind of this interrelated multi-layer issue that we're hoping to solve simply by changing how we take buildings down if they do have to come down. And then another imperative thing that we've been connecting to is the equity issue and material access and affordability. So by throwing away buildings and sending them to landfills, we remove the opportunity for people to have access to those, right? We're basically saying this building used to serve a purpose. It used to house people. It used to be a business, but now it's going to spend the rest of its life in a landfill, right? The more we throw away, the less we are able to access. And that means limited stakeholders have access to these high quality materials. And we want to diversify that access. We want to increase that access. We want our communities to have a hand in being able to access those resources. So that's another key point that we've been working through. And taking it one step further, we also have been continuously overlaying more and more data sets about building removal more broadly in response to questions about deconstruction's potential impact on affordable housing, affordability, and equity. So all of this is publicly available data that's available for free and accessible by anyone. And our office spent a few days collecting, downloading, sorting, triangulating, and mapping information. And this particular map shows, of course, where demolitions are occurring. But the purple circles, the big purple circles that you see on the screen, the bigger and darker the circle, the higher the property value was after a building was demolished and a new building was constructed. So sometimes this may be relevant in your community where you see a building being demolished that may have been affordable, and then what's replacing it might be a higher intensity or maybe more expensive. This is what we're starting to map, is kind of that correlation between demolition and new construction and housing affordability. So all of this has allowed us to kind of break open this discussion and really intelligently and creatively kind of make sure that these discussions are intersectional at a policy scale instead of happening in different spheres or different departments, right? We want all of this to come together to tell a broader story about why demolishing is not a great thing to do in the first place. And if you are demolishing, let's recover those materials instead to help alleviate that material affordability and accessibility. Oops. Now, shifting a little bit, one thing that we knew from the beginning is that we could not adopt a deconstruction ordinance if we didn't train a workforce to offer that service to our community. So one of our first steps to, advancing that policy discussion was to train a workforce of contractors. And we held a workforce training in 2019 in partnership with the National Park Service on one of their properties. In 2020, we held one in conjunction with a city-owned property, our Parks and Recreation Department. And then most recently, last November, right after our ordinance got adopted, we held a 3-week-long training at property owned by the San Antonio River Authority, which is a public agency that's charged with maintaining the San Antonio River and other creeks and waterways. And the training that we held last November, we brought in Repurpose Savannah, which is a all-women-led deconstruction nonprofit based in Savannah, Georgia, that takes this historic preservation lens to building removal and documents every building before they remove it, in addition to training up a workforce. And I'm going to take you behind the scenes in a short video to show you what that looked like and kind of the things that our attendees learned.
We are here on a property on Fitzhugh Road, which is owned by the San Antonio River Authority. And we are conducting a deconstruction training program in partnership between the Office of Historic Preservation and the San Antonio River Authority's property here.
I think it's an awesome experience. I've learned a lot. As far as resalvaging wood, it's going to be beneficial to us. The tools, the knowledge that they've been sharing with us, taking us out. I never imagined we could take a roof off from the attic out. When I got up there and started doing it, I was like, wow, okay. So it's been a real experience. A lot of knowledge has been poured out and knowledge that we could take back and use for our stores and for anybody else that's out there, that wants to do this kind of stuff.
I'm new at this, and so just working with the material, it almost has a life of itself. Like when you're trying to pull a board off, it's almost like it doesn't want to leave home, but it has to, because otherwise it's going to go in a dumpster. And we're also saving the environment by not having to cut down trees and throwing good material in the landfill.
What we see is that a portion of our materials is going right back into the buildings, and then another portion is going into craft materials and craft goods, home goods, things which will be cherished, a family table that you'll sit around for generations, heirloom items. These are really beautiful materials, and often they're best served by being accessible, touchable, visible. For folks who are interested in getting involved, there's a million ways to do so. And you don't have to swing a hammer to get involved in deconstruction. We need people at every level, working in policy, working in advocacy, education, business. Get in touch with the OHP. Your Office of Historic Preservation is going to be hosting many trainings just like this one.
Oops. Y'all, bear with me. There's always going to be one interesting slide error. But I love that video, especially Jessie, one of our trainees, who said, when you're trying to take off a board, it's almost like it doesn't want to leave home. That really hits me right in the heart. And also really demonstrates the connection to heritage, right? And this is another image from that structure that you saw being deconstructed. And one important thing to mention too is that these buildings were slated to be demolished, right? The River Authority was going to demolish 5 structures built in 1918. This was outside of the San Antonio city limits, so we actually didn't even have jurisdiction as a historic preservation office to save them. But thankfully, one of our city archaeologists flagged this to us and said, hey, let's talk to the River Authority to see if they might want to host a deconstruction contractor training here. And that's what we did. So this has opened up that level of collaboration and opportunity as well. And this particular picture on the screen shows a piece of lumber that has a lumber stamp from the lumber manufacturer back in the early 1900s. And really kind of connects us to the reality that deconstruction, yes, saves reusable materials from the landfills, but it can also save stories, and stories of a building's occupants, stories of how construction methods and trends changed over time, and stories of how a neighborhood developed and what kind of businesses were involved in that development. And The trainees, of course, uncovered this lumber company, and the practice of marking lumber was really common among businesses in San Antonio, akin to like putting your company's name on a sign in front of an active construction site like you see today. But the mark, of course, because it was on shiplap, was usually later obscured by interior finishes like wallpaper or drywall. And this particular lumber company was really prolific. They partnered with a lot of developers that developed some of our quintessential historic neighborhoods that are now historic districts. And this kind of documentation is just, it connects people to buildings that are being removed and just unearth stories that may not have been told, especially in historically underdocumented communities, right? That never really had the advantage of having HABs drawings or formal historic preservation surveys done back in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And sometimes materials can be the only physical evidence of histories that have been sometimes systematically erased over generations. So deconstruction really does offer the potential to uncover previously undocumented histories, setting up methodologies for collecting and interpreting, and most importantly, sharing uncovered history, all while connecting across time and across people who built our city's homes and businesses. And another amazing thing that happened at this particular site is the original owners of this property, their grandchildren, stopped by during deconstruction, and we were able to collect oral histories of what it was like for them to live in these buildings, which served as housing for ranchers, because this was right next to a very big ranch in San Antonio that operated in the early 1900s. And we would have never made those connections if these were just bulldozed, right? And they were actually able to recover some of the lumber and some of the windows and some of the materials to keep them connected to this site and have them build, you know, as May said, heirloom items from these materials that had meant so much to their history growing up. So it really, beyond just diverting building materials from a landfill, it kind of opens up this Pandora's box of opportunities for our field to engage at that level, which is just so exciting to us. And of course, that is trades education, but I want to back up just a little bit and emphasize that our office has been hosting workforce and community education around building repair and reuse for well over a decade. I look at this and say, this is the foundation for a culture of reuse, right? Like, we as preservationists are keeping things at the highest and best use. You know, historic preservation, the preservation of a whole building is waste prevention. I say that a lot now because it's true. But we have often held classes where we're teaching homeowners, like over here in this corner, we're teaching just a bunch of community members how to repair historic wood windows. And none of these trainees were ever expecting to launch their own company or business, but they just wanted to know how their building worked, right? And wanted to gain terminology and knowledge to engage with a wood window restoration contractor that they would eventually hire. I love these workshops. They're my favorite. But then most recently, we have launched what we call a Living Heritage Trades Academy, an actual formal college alternative to get people into our legacy trades businesses in San Antonio and rebuild our local trades pool to help restore our buildings. And we see deconstruction and reuse as a heritage trade because it is. And the more material we're able to divert from the landfill to uses like this, there's just such a clear connection there. And one of our local general contractors says it best, the best way to learn how to build a structure the correct way is to unbuild one first. So we're kind of taking that analogy and that reality and creating this workforce pipeline into deconstruction for our local contractors. And one of the last things that I want to mention is, in addition to the policy that we've developed, which is really exciting that we have this ordinance in place, we also have launched what we are calling a Material Innovation Center. This is something that we responded to in our policy development is we had to answer the question with our stakeholders, if we're going to convert 50 to 60 demolitions a year into deconstructions, where is all the material going to go, right? So when we started, San Antonio really didn't have a lot of what we call reuse infrastructure or large scale, warehouses where building materials go. So we knew that the city had to play some sort of role in at least receiving building materials, so we could direct them into their new use. But over the years, we were able to land on a site that I'm really excited to walk you through because it has such a historic connection, and turn it into this place where we're able to not only train future tradespeople, but also recover more building materials. And it's located at this former decommissioned Air Force base in San Antonio. San Antonio is Military City, USA, so we have a lot of bases. And this campus is owned by Port San Antonio. It's kind of this new public partnership that's charged with redeveloping this entire area that used to serve as an Air Force base. And they hadn't really known what to do with this collection of over 25 structures that used to serve as the housing for military generals and their families way back in the early 1900s and the World War I era. And these buildings have sat vacant for over 20 years. And it's this gorgeous collection of bungalows that our office looked at and said, we know what to do with these, right? So we were able to enter into a long-term lease agreement with Port San Antonio as the city to occupy these structures and turn it into kind of this innovation center. And the very, very best part about all of this is there's this legacy of salvage and reuse on this site already. I had mentioned the organ donor analogy and how we've been able to find evidence of, older structures reusing materials back in the day. And this is no exception. So on the left is an image of one of the garage structures on the site where you can immediately, when you look at that structure, you're like, okay, this has been cobbled together by a bunch of reclaimed lumber. I think it's beautiful. And then on the right is further evidence. This is from like a drop ceiling in one of the buildings that says Hagerstown, Maryland. And from this and other documentation, we were able to learn that a majority of the structures on this campus were constructed from wooden shipping crates that were used to ship airplane parts from Maryland to San Antonio in the early 1900s. So these are built from wooden shipping crates. That's so cool. That's so serendipitous. So we're able to point to this campus and say, this is a historic trend of reusing materials. And now we're going to stand up the opportunity to do that at scale once again. So right now, our office is working on these three components at the center. One is a tool library, because San Antonio does not have a tool library. And I think that's bonkers. And I want people to have access to tools because that can be a huge barrier to repairing buildings sometimes. So we're standing that up right now. The Material Innovation Center itself is dubbed as a hub for material receivership, donation, and storage. So we can use those in the future. And then, of course, a Living Heritage Trades Academy hub. All of those houses that were pictured on the previous slides are now like learning labs for people to learn how to restore windows, learn how to rehabilitate pre-1960s structures, and actually, grow their own skills on site. And this is what we're like envisioning at this site, this opportunity to have this diversity of uses and spaces where we're able to train, bring in new materials, use them for testing. And this slide is really exciting. We have partnered with a Austin-based architecture firm, Rios, that has kind of like taken us on as a pro bono client and really bought into this vision of this campus that really focuses on reuse. And right here, they're taking this campus that is largely vacant and turning them into, again, a tool library, a place for material receivership, contractors' offices, design offices, art studios, a place for UT San Antonio, our largest public university, to have architecture students come out and test and explore. I mean, this is so exciting to me. I have to reiterate again, like, we're an Office of Historic Preservation, and this is what we're talking about. I think this is incredibly exciting and really starts opening up like what our role as preservationists can be in our own communities, is talking about this. It's so cool. I get so excited. And I had mentioned kind of, again, the organ donor analogy. priority for us is to redirect the materials that are donated to our center into affordable housing repair and production. So on the left is an actual image of building materials that are stored in our warehouse right now. Those specific materials were recovered from that deconstruction contractor training, the video I showed you. And then we're using them for affordable housing projects that we have led for a long time, including Rehab-A-Rama, where we go into communities and restore houses for low-income residents. And instead of using virgin lumber that we know is not going to last very long, we're able to use high-quality materials from the construction era of these older houses, locally sourced, and use them to repair these buildings, which is incredibly exciting. And some other parts of this site include these like little casitas, and we're studying these as part of another effort that we are calling salvage to ADU, or salvage to accessory dwelling unit. So connecting this again to affordable housing and using these reclaimed materials as feedstock for new buildings, we like to say that we're starting to revive kind of the kit house idea. Many of you may know about this year's kit houses, where you could order a house in a catalog, have the materials delivered, and have it constructed. And so many of these are designated landmarks or part of historic districts today across the country. And we're like, why can't we revive this? Why can't we turn our center into the IKEA for small scale housing, except using reclaimed materials to do that? So again, kind of this intersectional approach to all of these different policy considerations: climate, affordable housing, preservation, waste, and wrapping them all up together. And what is incredibly exciting is this is happening real time right now because we're able to finesse our partnerships with our local universities. So these images were taken at the Material Innovation Center at that bungalow colony site just 2 weeks ago. Our office partnered with our local AIA, American Institute for Architects, Committee on the Environment, to host a tour of the center with local architects to talk about the role that architects can play in reusing materials and buildings in San Antonio. And the images that you see here are from a studio, an architecture studio that is using materials that are donated to the Material Innovation Center to start designing new small-scale housing units out of salvage materials. So you see these mock-ups here. They were able to use what was donated as kind of their feedstock for developing these new kit houses that we're exploring. So I get like almost emotional looking at these pictures because we're able to lead these conversations as a preservation office and preservation entity and build enduring relationships with architects, planners, designers, educators. And I have an architectural background. Most exciting to me is teaching our future architects that reuse comes first at all scales, whether that be reuse of existing buildings, and if you can't do that, reuse of existing building materials and the integration of the two. So this is so exciting to be able to do that and lead those conversations locally because it is making a difference. So our long-term vision, it goes well beyond just capital P preservation. I just talked about salvage to ADU, but we're also talking about how this space might serve as a disaster resiliency hub. San Antonio gets a lot of really damaging storms that are not hurricanes because we're not close enough to the Gulf Coast, but kind of the residual effects of those. So how can we use the center to have materials stock on site to rapidly deploy to repair existing structures? And then how can we expand this campus into the reuse of other materials like textiles and electronics and more to kind of really further integrate this culture of reuse into other spaces? So this is how kind of this culture of reuse has really been, making a difference locally and can really scale up, I think, in the next few decades to affect societal level change. These are kind of the, again, the mantras, the messages that we're using is that we're able to start foster a community of exchange, right? Where we're sharing more resources together and connect people to each other through tool sharing, through material sharing, all of that, improve the equity of access to resources and materials, and in turn make them more affordable and accessible. And then at its most fundamental, we're working on building a more resilient and circular, meaning connected future, and really kind of focusing on breaking that cycle of making it easy to take things, make them and waste them, and instead make it easier to reuse. So that's all I have for you today. I'm really excited to answer any questions that you have and keep the discussion going well beyond the time we have today. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And it's good to hear that you have the ability to go beyond time, because there are a lot of questions. We have some in the chat, we have some in the Q&A, and I know that I've been talking with my colleagues too on the side. This is, someone just said absolutely amazing. I was going to say inspirational. Like, this is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. So we do have a lot of questions. Let me jump in. So I'm going to take these chronologically. So as people are giving us questions, we might jump around topics a little bit. So Olivia K asks, where are the products stored that come from deconstruction sites? I know you were building something in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. Our ordinance does not regulate where building materials go, so it's kind of a mixture. If someone is deconstructing a building, they have the option to keep some of those materials on site to use in new construction or rehabilitation. We see that pretty often. We also see some of the materials going to local salvage stores. So we have several businesses and new ones that are popping up in response to this ordinance that collect architectural salvage and lumber and resell them to communities. And then if someone has exhausted all options, that's where our Material Innovation Center comes in. Sometimes we refer to it as the last stop before the landfill, right? So we're filling this gap where if someone has building materials from a deconstruction or even a renovation that they don't want to keep anymore, they have the option to donate it to that center. So there are a lot of different places that it goes, but our goal is to not send them to the landfill.
Right. And so I was also wondering, sorry, I've got it written down up here so I don't forget, so I have a lot of questions. Can interested communities in Utah and nationwide find this ordinance on your website? Do you have like a quick link for it in case any communities watching want to sort of like crib a little bit?
Yes. Oh my gosh, please. So our website is sareuse.com.
Okay.
So we try to make the URL small. And that's where our entire deconstruction ordinance lives. And it's the website for our entire program as well. So you're able to see some of the videos that I showed, some of the other resources that we've developed in addition to the actual ordinance.
Yeah, I loved that kickoff video. That really tightly wrapped up like the whole dream and impetus of the program. So Amber Anderson, who actually works here at the Utah SHPO, who is also hugely inspired, asked, did you have any trouble getting contractors interested in the deconstruction training? And if so, how did you deal with that? Were there any incentives for them?
Oh, that's such a good question. So actually, no. What we did as the city, San Antonio maintains kind of an entire database of all of their contractors. And I just like bombarded them. Like I downloaded the list, I filtered by rehab contractors, demolition contractors, house moving contractors, and said, hey, this is probably going to be an ordinance in the future. Do you guys want to get trained? And here's why it's important. So we actually had an overwhelming interest from the beginning, even in those early years, like 2019, 2020, with people looking to add like that as a service pathway into their business. And I will say now that, of course, an ordinance has been adopted, we've seen like a major growth in people having interest in that trade. But that's what I would recommend, is kind of emphasizing, how it could be a utility to the community, demonstrating if there's a community need, even if you're a preservation office. Like the way we connect this is because we have local historic districts where we're able to say you need to restore your siding or you need to patch something in kind. That's like an automatic demand that's never going to go away, is these historic buildings, right? So we've been careful to kind of tailor that language and saying that recovering those building materials is advantageous to those clients, and could be advantageous to you as a contractor as well, because you can also sell them. So there's a lot of creative ways to message that. And I'm happy to talk more about that with anyone that's interested. Please email me at any time, please.
You might have takers. If you could put your email in the chat, you absolutely might have takers. Because I think there are a lot of people who, if they're not able to enact this whole program right now, might be interested in enacting bits and pieces of it. and get us towards something like this at a piecemeal scale.
Mhm.
So we have a lot of, as Tiffany Green says, nuts and bolts questions, a lot of things that are like, how can I start doing this in my community? So David Ammett from the Utah Department of Transportation wants to hear more about how San Antonio got this program up and running. Did you guys have to create your own demo crew? It sounds like maybe contractors. And then salvage yards that predated the effort. I think we started to answer that a little bit. And then he also wants to know, is this kind of part of your city's culture? Like, how did you maybe package it so that people would be supportive of this?
Yeah, ooh, I love that question about the culture. San Antonio does have an advantage in that we're a historic city, right? Like everyone knows about the Alamo. But San Antonio definitely has like a culture of reuse inherently because heritage tourism is such a big driver for our city. So we do have that advantage, but I think that a lot of communities might again be able to package it in a certain way. We did not have a lot of reuse and salvage stores. And when I say that, I'm kind of comparing ourselves to like Portland or other cities that have done similar things that had massive reuse nonprofits that were able to kind of immediately jump in and say, yes, we have the capacity to take in more materials. So that's why we focus so much on training, right? And anyone that's looking to start this, like I will emphasize again, this took us almost 5 years to get a policy adopted. But that's okay. Like we were able to integrate all of these other program elements in between them that weren't regulatory, but they helped us stand up this concept, right? And that includes workforce training, community engagement, even just like talking about this with our constituents more and more, and making that connection between deconstruction and material reuse and preservation. So there are a lot of ways to kind of approach this piecemeal without jumping right into a policy effort, if that makes sense.
It does. It does, and it's good to hear.
Yeah.
I've got two related questions. So Paul Larson asks about any opposition to the program from maybe the development industry, the legislature. Similarly, Kelsey Mass, who used to be here in Utah and is now over making things good in Detroit. She asked how you got political stakeholders on board, like mayoral, city council support, anything like that, people who want to start working on this, any lessons learned?
Oh, that's my favorite question. Building political willpower is my favorite thing to do. So yes, those are great questions. I had mentioned at the beginning how one of our first steps in launching like a policy initiative was to form a deconstruction advisory committee. And on our program website, you can actually see all of the stakeholders that we included if you're interested in that. And it spanned the gamut. Like we immediately roped in people that could be deemed as adversarial to something like this, including the development community, demolition contractors, what have you. And that was really important, right? Like it's very rare for environmental advocates and development and business advocates to be in a room together and hold space to talk about this, right? And that actually, those committee meetings really helped each side share like what they were interested in, what their concerns might be. So definitely recommend that. And something that was really great for us is we actually ended up getting support from what I refer to as our developer super PAC in San Antonio, because they were part of that advisory committee from the beginning. And because we started making all of these connections to affordable housing, public health, workforce development, equity, material affordability and access, waste diversion, like the more you overlay kind of this intersectional nature of what deconstruction and reuse can be, the less and less, or the more and more it becomes difficult to argue against. So that's actually specifically something that they said to us when they expressed their support before it went to city council was, like this is just another development policy that we may not really want to see enacted, but we get it. Like we get why it's important and we actually understand the mission behind it. And we understand the outcomes that it will address. And a lot of that was driven by data and things like that. So we did have opposition, but we brought main people into our corner through that multi-layered approach. So that's one of the biggest things that I think was in our favor. And then, of course, that relates to our political willpower. We educated our elected officials in the same way and really understood what they were interested in. Some of them are really interested in public health, which is how we communicated the importance of really hot days and how demolition is air pollution, right? Some of them were really interested in workforce development, which is when we talked about the impact of how deconstruction employs 6 times more people than demolition. So all of those talking points, like we literally had a document of just like talking points that we could like pull out in those spaces. So over time, through the years, we were able to really articulate that in the way that you're seeing today. It took time, though.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely hearing that it took time. And honestly, you said, it was about 5 years. That's pretty fast. I mean, that's fast for government, not to mention something that is, as you have said, transformational as this.
Yeah.
Question from Sean Lamar. We kind of did answer about pushback from developers, time and cost. Sounds like you just got them in your corner. But what about like liability for like injuries and things for having community and residents accessing the materials? Does the city of San Antonio have liability? Did you guys work around that?
That's such an interesting question. So one thing that I will mention right off the bat is, and this is a good talking point to have in your corner too, is that demolition or deconstruction is actually like safer than demolition in a lot of ways. You're able to, a lot of times, especially when you're talking about hazardous materials or abatement, like even if your city or your state requires a building to be abated before it's demolished, it's very rare that you're going to get everything. And when you're demolishing something, you're creating that plume of dust that is affecting everyone around you. So deconstruction offers the opportunity to have more things abated and uncovered. And I hearken it back to deconstruction is just unbuilding. It's almost like construction in reverse. So any sort of liabilities or safety issues that you might perceive as with building a house, it's similar to unbuilding. So we never really had those being like a huge sticking point for safety because we were able to talk more about like public health implications and community safety as well. Now, I will say, when we receive materials donated to our center, for example, sometimes we get things that are naily, that still have nails sticking out, that still have like lead paint on it. So a lot of that goes into how like reuse architectural salvage businesses operate with disclaimers, like if you're afraid of lead paint, don't handle this. But then we're using our connections to students where our architecture students, again, my favorite thing about all of this is they're going to work, volunteering at our Material Innovation Center and denailing lumber so that we can make it more readily available to students. And again, as someone that went through a traditional architectural education that had very limited access to actually hands-on work, they're always excited to do it. So we've kind of been able to kind of quell that issue that way, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah, no, that's great. Few more questions. They are slowing down. So maybe in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So if you guys have more questions, let's get them in. So Mark Smedley, who is from Heber City, which is adjacent to my hometown. Hey, Mark, I live up in Midway. He asks, do the costs become part of and added to development costs? Does this just become a part of doing business in San Antonio construction and deconstruction?
Yeah, I would say yes, it's part of doing business now. But I'm glad you mentioned costs. Like this is the 2 key questions that kept coming up early on in introducing this policy topic were, where is all the material going to go, right? And I kind of touched on that in the presentation, but also what is the cost differential and how are we going to close that gap? So something that we also leaned on with data, and this is something one of our developer advisory committee members did right away. He pulled his own network of demolition contractors and developers and figured out what the cost differential would be between deconstruction and demolition of certain structures. So, right, we're looking at residential structures, maybe like 8-plex, missing middle housing, and then you start getting into commercial. And the 2 primary cost levers with deconstruction are time and labor. So depending on who you're talking to, added labor is a good thing because you're inducing more labor into the economy, but it may not be great for a property owner. So that's part of the reason why our ordinance specifically focuses on small scale residential housing. We were very bold at the beginning, and we really wanted to include commercial structures, and maybe down the line, we might amend our ordinance to include that as well. But we realized that we just did not have the infrastructure and the contractors' knowledge to be able to quickly dismantle large-scale commercial structures that were built with masonry and limestone. That's just a whole nother beast. So here in San Antonio, we were able to figure out that the cost differential on average between a small scale house to demolish and deconstruct is about $3,000, which is not high. Like, San Antonio is a big city, but we have a low cost of living. So in other cities, that cost differential is going to be bigger. But then you start thinking about it in a bigger picture where demolition is a sunk cost. I like to say, when you're demolishing a building, you're paying someone to throw away money, because that's the truth. In a lot of cases, especially if you're dealing with an older structure that has really nice, like, shiplap, like my 1920s house here. So with deconstruction, you're able to recoup some of that cost by selling the material. There's also different tax abatements that you could explore, and Repurpose Savannah uses that a lot with their clients. So maybe upfront, the cost might be higher, but you're able to recoup some of that down the line. So that's another, like, really big conversation that's always happening when you're talking about this, but we were able to communicate it that way.
Okay, that's great. Another question about sort of political finagling. How did you get your zoning and planning departments on board with this? That's another key player that we haven't really touched on too much.
Oh, yes, that is so true. So San Antonio is also a little unique. Our office is its own standalone department, which is sometimes rare. Like, most of the time they're nestled in like a planning or development department from the get-go. But we also have an outsized development review capability. So, and the reason I'm saying that is that we're communicating with our development services department, which is our permitting department, every single day. They're also our zoning department. So we had a bunch of city departments on our advisory committee as well. So when we formed our advisory committee, we had development services, planning, solid waste, sustainability, innovation, housing, all of these departments sitting in that advisory committee as well. So that definitely was something that we had to work on, especially with our development services department. A lot of times when we start talking about this, people are going to be like, what? Like, why would you want to do that? Demolition is so fast. And we're like, yeah, that's the problem. So it did take a lot of conversations. And one thing that I always recommend too to communities, if you're a state or local agency, it's a lot of law too. We had to talk to a lot of attorneys in our office and our city when we're talking about deconstruction, especially if the city is paying for it. A lot of like Fourth Amendment laws. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but it was fascinating being in these conversations. So this is a much bigger topic that I can dive into with people individually or sometime later. But yes, same kind of commitment to communicating with our own peers that we did with our elected officials. So yeah, that didn't really answer the question, but yeah.
I mean, I think everyone's zoning and planning department is going to be different, right? That's what makes our towns diverse. And so I think people know best what is going to be the selling point for their own zoning and planning department. And if they don't, then you might just have to sleuth around and try to discover that. But yes, it does sound like you've done a great job of building up, like you said, all of these talking points to talk to a lot of different audiences. And there's kind of a buffet of options that everyone can see something they like in this program.
Yes, buffet is a perfect, I say that a lot, like menu too. But I will say too, like, these talking points can be really great levers to, like, a lot of times too, our city council, has the authority to direct the city to do things. So if you have strong support from your elected officials, it becomes very difficult for other departments that might be more resistant to change to being resistant to change. Like, it's just a reality that they're going to have to adapt. And that's also true when you're able to share this information with residents who then can become vocal supporters on your behalf to their elected officials, this kind of like chain of command. The citizens are in charge. Then you have city council, then you have the city. So by widely communicating this at any juncture, even by making animations, really kind of helps normalize deconstruction is something that is going to happen. And we have to all work together to adjust our policies and procedures to make it work. So that definitely also helped.
Yeah. No, that squirrel in that animation was doing the heavy lifting of advocacy for real. And so that brings me to the very last question from Zibby Wilder. She is curious how your position came about. It would be great to understand where to start and how people can advocate in their own communities to get this kind of a circular economy up and running.
Oh, yeah. So when I hear position, so this is my full-time job now, which is great, but it wasn't until March of last year. So it's been a little over a year that I've been fully focused on this. And before that, this project was an other duties as assigned. It was a special project. I was the primary case manager, one of the primary case managers for our Landmarks Commission. That was my major role. So a lot of it is being scrappy, buying into the reality that this is something that's important. But that's kind of how we started it. Was we convinced someone from city council, or actually our neighborhoods did, to start looking at demolition in San Antonio as a negative thing and directing our office to look at deconstruction. That was really our first thing, was getting that direction from city council. And that immediately started off the domino effect of what I talked about today. But that's why I always emphasize that preservation needs to be part of the discussion. And in my ideal world, should be leading in the way that we are. Because we understand historic building materials, because we understand how our historic buildings were built, we understand the communities that live and reside in these historic communities. So I think we have a lot of utility to provide to this conversation. So, I mean, the best advice I can give is either to jump on it, start talking about it is what worked for us, and to kind of start leading that conversation, I think. I'll think on that a little bit more and provide a better articulate answer. But the best answer always is just to start. And please use anything we've already created to your advantage, because that's what I want everyone to do. We're here to help.
It's so great to see that someone has some sort of a template, right? And I'm sure that in other communities and other states, any implementation of this sort of thing will look different. But like you said, just getting started and knowing that, a community like San Antonio has kind of blazed the trail is so helpful.
Yay, I'm glad you think so. And one thing I will mention too, in the next month or so, I have worked on what I've called a circular heritage toolkit. So it's a short document of almost everything that I touched on today. And so it's written specifically to historic preservation. That kind of document doesn't exist yet, where we're talking about deconstruction in the context of the heritage conservation field and how we might be able to advance that. So look out for that in the next few months. It'll be made available, and it talks about everything we've talked about today, including all of the unique components of cities and governments, your elected officials, your legislatures, your policies, your zoning department. All of that is kind of touched on in that toolkit, with the goal of being able to hand that off to communities like you to work with. So that'll be available soon too.
That's awesome. Thank you for that great resource.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. So again, everyone, thank you all for coming out to hear about circular economy with Stephanie Phillips. This has been really eye-opening. There's a lot of things coming in the comments now that are just singing your praises. So thank you so much. This was absolutely perfect. And what a great way to kick off Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month. And I do want people to know that if you do like this sort of stuff, head over to ushipo.utah.gov/AHP month. We do have upcoming webinars throughout the month. And then we also have a back catalog of other webinars. And
thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks. Have a good afternoon. Great seeing you all. And have a great Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month, everybody.